Well, let's now look at some of the issues we've been discussing here from Washington, still digesting the fact that Donald Trump will be back in the White House on the 20th of January. I'm joined by our guests, Rina Shah, Conservative commentator and political strategist. I have Matthew Duss, Executive Vice President of the Centre for International Policy, and Robert Hunter, former US Ambassador to NATO under President Clinton. Thank you very much. A lot to discuss, but let's start with the new news in the last couple of hours, which is Vladimir Putin, Rina, saying that Trump showed bravery with the assassination attempt, showed he was a man, and says there's an opportunity now to restore relations between the US and Russia. What is your reaction to that, and what do you think it might mean for Ukraine?
I am completely unsurprised by this news of Putin praising Trump, essentially. They never lost touch after Trump left the White House in 2020. We know that. We know they've had communications. We know that they had a very cozy relationship for years. None of this is a secret. But what now we know is that perhaps the very first thing that Trump does when he gets in office in January is essentially tries to broker peace over between Ukraine and Russia.
Well, peace is a good thing, isn't it?
Peace is an excellent thing. But what this kind of peace means is a concession of land. And we know this also because Vice President-elect J.D. Vance, the current senator from Ohio, who of course will be vacating that seat, he led on to that. He said that he and Trump have that desire to do this. And because Trump and Putin are so cozy, they can get it done quick. My sense has always been that Trump is looking at this re-entry to the White House as a legacy moment. He needs to do something massive in not just the first year, in the first month. And because of those close ties with Putin, he can deliver a win there and point to that and say, aha, look at me. I am such a contrast to these dark years of Biden-Harris. He is going to want to paint a certain picture, and by getting this done quickly, he will get that first win on which he will try to build off of.
OK, Matthew, this potentially is an absolute nightmare for President Zelensky. How should the Ukrainian president play the coming weeks before January the 20th?
Yeah. Well, I think we saw just the other day, Zelensky congratulated Trump quite effusively as well on his victory, clearly recognizing what was coming. So he's going to do everything he can to build that relationship. But I think it will probably go as we just heard. Again, peace is not bad. The question is on what terms, and is that peace durable? And I think that is the concern that a lot of Ukrainians have and a lot of others in Europe have as well. On what terms will that peace be made? What concessions will be demanded or required or pressed upon Ukraine? And does that mean an end to the war, or does that mean it simply moves into a new phase for Putin having some kind of grander plan? And the concern is, and I think it's quite legitimate, is, look at what Putin said to Trump. He understands that Trump is very susceptible to flattery, as do many leaders around the world. And the question will be, OK, what will Trump agree to?
So, Robert, you're a former ambassador to NATO. Does it look likely that Putin's war, his invasion of Ukraine, is going to have paid off, at least in part?
Well, it's always good to talk. And one of our problems, we haven't been talking enough to them. They haven't been talking enough to us. We need to recognize that Russia is not going to go away. For a number of years, going back under a couple of administrations of different parties, there's been a pretense that somehow Russia's going to disappear. We've got this war, but it's not the only thing there. There's going to need to be some coming to terms with the Russians of a future relationship, of which ending the war in Ukraine is going to be part of it.
So Zelensky's going to have to give up some land.
He's probably going to have to give up the Crimea in any event. Nobody really wants Crimea. It really wasn't Ukrainian, except by accident. But the real way of working at this, it's been clear for years, is that Ukraine gets sovereignty over all the territory, and then the areas which are Russian-speaking, Russian culture, get a lot of autonomy. That is possible, but it's going to take a while. It's not going to take place, as Trump says, between now and the inauguration.
Matthew.
It's not going to take place soon thereafter, but it's going to take place.
Yeah, and I do think that's a real question, is whatever agreement is gotten, whatever negotiated peace we get, does that actually preserve Ukraine's independence and control over its own territory and its nascent democracy, or does it simply make Ukraine part of Putin's sphere of influences, which is clearly something he wants?
And going back quickly to you, Robert, if the US pulls out of its support for Ukraine under Trump, do you see any scenario where the rest of NATO, the rest of the EU, can pick up the slack?
Well, first, I don't think Trump's going to pull out all support for Ukraine. He can't afford to as president of the United States because that would undercut what NATO and others are doing. He's got to work with the allies, and I think he really does understand the importance of NATO, despite things he's said and things he has done. But there's going to need to be a recognition that Ukraine is really in between West and East, a thoroughly Western country, economically, politically, democracy, but a neutral country as between Russia and NATO. The idea that Ukraine will sometime join NATO is a non-starter. It takes unanimity, 32 votes, and that's never going to happen. That's been a false promise made to Zelensky.
OK. Now, it's worth reminding everyone who's watching this how the US system works, because we all saw Donald Trump, the new president. He's not the president. He's not the president until the 20th of January. So, Rina, what happens between now and then? Is Joe Biden a complete lame duck when it comes to standing up to Putin, for example? And let's turn our attention to the Middle East, standing up to his ally, Netanyahu, who's ignored him for coming up to 13 months now. Whenever the US has said restraint, Netanyahu's done the opposite. Now, does Netanyahu basically have a free hand to further bombard Gaza and Lebanon?
Netanyahu has had a free hand for many months to do whatever he wants, and he's almost laughed in the face of Biden and Blinken. Harris hasn't even been at the table, I believe, in many ways. The disrespect from Netanyahu to Biden has been almost palpable in this town. I can tell you this. Biden became a lame duck the minute he dropped out of the race when he announced he wasn't going to run for re-election. I have been not just disappointed to see how much of a backseat he's taken in governing, in trying to talk about the needs of this society. He can be a president for all Americans in the next few weeks. We'll see the certification of the votes, of course, on January 6, 2025. Until then, it is President-elect Trump. And we, unfortunately, with our language around here, and because we hadn't seen it, Trump got kicked out of the White House in 2020, and people have still called him president. We do that to our former presidents. I have gone a step further to remind people he's a former president, and we still have one here at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. He's just quite silent. Today, he came out and he told us that he's going to leave us with the strongest economy. It's hard to believe that when the vast majority of Americans, I believe, went to the polls on Election Day, the 5th, just a couple of days ago, rejecting the Democrats' policies, basically spitting in their face and saying, you're telling us one thing, but we feel another. The cost of living, I believe, was front of mind for Americans coast to coast, in rural areas, urban areas. Trump was able to basically expand the vote for himself with young people, minorities, women, particularly suburban women, which is what Harris really thought she had lockbox. So I think there are a range of issues here, but I have to say, a number of experts disagree with me on this. But I really think things were so bad, what I saw shake out the other night, that I believe that any Democrat would have lost and any Republican would have won.
It's the economy stupid.
Indeed.
Matthew, going back to the Middle East, could you see another argument that Biden was worried? I mean, this was a unique period the last year. It was an election campaign. There were political considerations. Now he doesn't have any political constraints. He could, if he wanted to, put the ultimate leverage on Netanyahu because the US controls the money, controls the weapons. He could if he wanted. Do you think he will?
I don't think he will. I wish he would, because it's not. I mean, Netanyahu knows that even if Joe Biden were to withhold weapons, they would simply be turned right back on January 20th. And it would take Israel a while to just go through they have weapons to use in that interim period. My argument has been Biden should have done this months ago. He has simply refused to impose any real costs on Netanyahu. The United States is the only country that can really do that. Biden has refused. One thing he could do, however, is to affirm. We saw this letter from Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin giving them 30 days, raising concerns about the restriction of humanitarian aid into Gaza. That 30 days is up next week. They can say clearly that Israel is doing this, because I guarantee you, I've heard this from them myself, they know this is happening. This letter, in my view, was a farce. They know that Israel has been restricting humanitarian aid into Gaza since basically October 8th. And under U.S. law, U.S. military aid needs to be suspended once the president is informed of this. So I would hope that just for honesty's sake, President Biden would choose to speak clearly and truthfully about the fact that this has been part of Israel's strategy in Gaza.
So, Robert, if Biden wanted to put the pressure on, how quickly could he, with the tools at his disposal, stop the Israeli bombardment of Lebanon and Gaza?
Tomorrow morning. He just has to cut off all military aid to Israel. He'd give them some warning time. We've got, as has just been said, 6 days from now, the deadline comes on humanitarian aid with unspecified things if Israel
and
doesn't
why do you've been in this town a very long time. You're an ambassador during the Clinton era. You know Joe Biden. Why is he being so stubborn on this issue?
Well, two things. One was the electoral politics leading till now. The other thing is Joe Biden believes in it. He believes in letting Israel do everything it wants to do. His entire career has shown that when he was in the Senate, vice president, and president. But he's got 74 days now to be president of the United States. Our interests, the United States' interests have been, and his reputation in the world has been severely damaged. He could, as certainly 6 days from now, he should say, open the borders to humanitarian aid or zero further help in any way. And then I need you to stop the war, and I'll get Hamas to stop the war one way or another before the 20th of January. But I also have to say another thing. There was also the nuclear agreement with Iran, which Netanyahu killed. Iran stopped its nuclear work. Netanyahu killed it. Trump quit it. Biden refused to rejoin it. He could tomorrow morning say, I am going to rejoin the so-called Joint Comprehensive.
OK, Robert, very quickly, Rina, we get to January the 20th. With regard to policy towards Israel and those wars, what would your take on what Trump's going to do? He likes to be seen as a peacemaker. He says he wants the Nobel Peace Prize, but it'll be a peace on Netanyahu's terms, will it not?
Indeed, it will. And I think it does come rather secondary to what's between Ukraine and Russia. That's what Trump wants to get done first because it serves him. Right. And that is what Trump does. He says it's an America First policy agenda he's going to take on. It's rather Trump first, because he needs to look like he's done something right and that he was wronged in 2020. And so that's what you do when, again, you want to put out this political message indirectly. But I want to go a step further. And he also wants to give the Republican electorate what they wanted, which is to end these massive aid packages. There's been such great dissatisfaction. And as we know, Muslim Americans and the Arab American community has felt so betrayed by the Biden-Harris administration on the issues of what's going on in Gaza that I think Trump wants to try to put a foot there and see what he can get done so he can look like a hero to them, too. But it really starts with aid packages and really killing those, working with a Republican-led Congress to do so.
Rina Shah, Matthew Duss and Robert Hunter, thank you very much for joining us here as we debate what is going to happen in that White House after January the 20th. And, in fact, between now and January the 20th, that is a wrap from us here in our special rooftop studio in Washington, D.C., handing you back to Sami in Doha.